The iPhone 13 launch, it is fast approaching. And as we approach Apple's release of its latest iPhone, one rumor has thrown a wrench into a lot of people's hopes and dreams. Welcome everybody to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here. You can find me on Twitter at Andrew_OSU. And a lot of people were hoping that Apple's new iPhone 13 lineup would feature in-screen Touch ID. But the latest rumors say that while this was in advanced testing, it isn't going to make it into Apple's 2021 release cycle. In this video, I'm going to walk you through Touch ID versus Face ID. I'm going to talk about why people may prefer one over the other. And finally, we'll talk about what Apple's future plans may be for these two biometric security options. Touch ID predated Face ID on the iPhones. Apple, for quite a long time, had Touch ID built into the home buttons on iPhone. And then, gradually over time, Apple moved from Touch ID to Face ID. And we're still more or less in that transition. iPad Air, for example, still has Touch ID, but they baked it into the power button, the toggle button, on the iPad Air itself. Then the iPad Pros, they have Face ID built in. So there's kind of a range, and Touch ID right now is usually relegated to the more affordable options, while Face ID is on the high-end option. On the iPhone 12 lineup, all of the iPhones, the iPhone 12 mini, 12, 12 Pro, and 12 Pro Max, all have Face ID. But some people don't love Face ID. Some people still prefer Touch ID. They don't like the idea of having their face scanned whenever they go to authenticate their phone to gain access. And during the pandemic, it has made it more difficult. If you do have an Apple Watch on, you are able to get into your iPhone when wearing a mask. Face ID will detect that your face is wearing a mask, and it'll authenticate you using your Apple Watch, assuming it is close proximity to your phone. But if you don't have an Apple Watch and you're wearing a mask, you're stuck using passcodes every single time that you need to unlock your iPhone. It can be quite annoying. So for those people especially, they really want to see Touch ID return. Unfortunate for them, Apple does seem to be all in on Face ID. Gurman outlines that Apple's plans still include having iPhones 13, 14 all feature Face ID, but Touch ID may make a comeback in some ways. The entry-level phones, they could possibly offer in-display Touch ID, while the higher-end phones stick to Face ID. Or Apple could maybe just do away with Touch ID altogether. Maybe they don't end up rolling this feature out that they have been testing, and maybe the entry-level phones will have Face ID as we know it today with the notch, but the Pros, the high-end phones, they could incorporate Face ID into the display. So there's no longer a notch, but you're still able to authenticate with a notchless phone using Face ID. So that is also a possibility, and I think more likely. If I want to throw out a third scenario, this is the world that I would kind of like to live in. And that's where the iPhone, 14 Pro, 14 Pro Max, maybe they include both. That way, if you're wearing a mask, you could authenticate via Touch ID, or if you don't have a mask on, you can authenticate via Face ID. And for those who want to be extra secure, they could require both forms of authentication. You could use Touch ID and Face ID to authenticate things. That way, you're kind of adding an additional layer of security into there. So I kind of like the idea where there's both, but that may be too expensive for Apple to actually implement in future iPhones. What we know now, though, is that iPhone 13 seems to be sticking with Face ID. Touch ID will likely not be on Apple's new September iPhones, and if it returns at all, it'll likely be coming to a lower entry-level handset versus the higher-end flagship devices. What do you guys think? Are you guys sad that Touch ID will not be in Apple's new iPhone lineup? Let me know over on Twitter at Andrew_OSU. And stay tuned, we have a lot more content as we approach Apple's release of the iPhone 13 lineup.